Hi, good afternoon. So I'm going to start this exactly in the manner that Namita Bandare started this with Vikas Sarup yesterday. So she asked the audience how many had seen Slumdog Millionaire, and so I'm going to ask you all how many have seen Spotlight? Oh wow, there you go. Okay. So I'm not sure I need to introduce this at all, but you know, anyone who's seen the film would recognize, you know, Mike's character played by Mark Ruffalo, passionate, adamant, persevering, everything you would expect from the first-rate investigative journalist, which you are. So, Mike, yeah, please give my hand round. So he remains on the Spotlight team of the Boston Globe, and over the years has been involved with a range of investigations, 9/11, the mental health care system, prison reforms, debt collection, and so on. But obviously, most famously, I think now, part of the team that investigated and wrote in 2002 about the phenomenon of pedophilia and sexual abuse by the Catholic clergy in the Boston area. And what this showed was that there was a pattern to the abuse, and there was also a pattern to the cover-up, because they kept moving priests from one parish to another parish in the hope that the problem would go away, which of course it didn't. This was also the investigation that saw the resignation of the Archbishop of Boston, Cardinal Lowe, a man who was in contention to become Pope, I think. And then this ballooned into a nationwide scandal with more and more victims of abuse coming forward out of the shadows, different parts of the United States, as well as different parts in the gold. 2 Oscars for the film Spotlight in 2015, including Best Picture, and Michael has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes and is the co-author of 2 books, one of them called Betrayal. And there is this line in Betrayal that I'd like to cite, because I think it sort of had a resonance with me. There's a line in which you suggest that either one of the most important consequences or the most important consequence of the investigation was a kind of deterrence. And there's a line that says, "Never again would the Catholic clergy in the United States knowingly allow a sexually abusive priest to have access to children." I think that's a remarkable line and a remarkable achievement. So okay, I'm going to start with a very, very general question. Do you think the Catholic Church is or was at the very epicenter of child sexual abuse? I mean, what I'm asking is whether you think the incidence of such cases is any less, for instance, in, say, educator sexual abuse, which is the term that's used for, you know, teachers and children and you know, the kind of stuff that happens in public schools.
Yeah, I think child sexual abuse is a problem in many sectors of our society. It's a problem in families, within families, number one. It's a problem in our school system. It's a problem in the Boy Scouts. And I think the reality is every time you have a situation where there's a real imbalance of power and you have defenseless children in that institution, and you have an institution that is not really fully accountable to the public, it's kind of a prescription for disaster. It really is a prescription for the frequent abuse of children. All that said, I do believe that the problem is especially acute within the Catholic Church, because number one, it was so assiduously covered up by top officials in the church, by cardinals, by the Vatican itself. The other reason I think the problem is especially endemic in the Catholic Church is because of the celibacy requirement for Catholic priests. As most of you probably know, that Catholic priests are required to live their lives without sex of any kind. And I think this is a problem for a number of reasons. It does tend to, the Catholic Church also, because it's an all-male, very secretive institution, it does tend to attract men who have sexual problems. But I think more important, the celibacy requirement creates, to be very, very blunt, it's a little bit of a protection racket, and here's what I mean. You know, you have priests who are, after all, human beings, and we do know, I think, at this stage, that human beings, one of the things they do is have sex. And so the reality is that despite this requirement that priests live their entire lives as priests without sex, the reality is that many are having sex with women, and many are having sex with men, and probably the smallest cohort is having sex with children. But because all of this sex is illegal in the eyes of the church, all of these priests, bishops, cardinals who are having sex want to keep it quiet, and they're not going to shine the light or accuse a fellow priest of having sex with a child when he himself is having sex with a woman or a man. So I do think for these reasons the problem is particularly endemic within the Catholic Church. I guess a third reason is, you know, church leaders, bishops, one of their responsibilities very specifically is to protect the church from scandal. And they take that very seriously. And I think what happens as a result of that is you have high-ranking officials in the institution who end up caring more about the institution than about the people the institution is supposed to serve. So I do think that while the sexual abuse of children is a terrible problem throughout our society, I think it's especially acute in the church. When you add the reality that the church presents itself as a paragon of morality, then you start to also get into the problem of hypocrisy.
I'm just going to take off from something you said. This idea that celibacy could be an important factor for this. So, I mean, one half of the theory is that, you know, sexual frustration finds an outlet in pedophilia. But do you think this tradition of celibacy actually draws or attracts pedophiles into the clergy?
Well, I think just it's really the culture of secrecy, I think, is probably a big piece of what attracts pedophiles often to the Catholic Church. It's a place where the protection of priests who have sex with people is understood. Pedophiles are generally quite smart and quite shrewd, and I think they can recognize an environment in which they're likely to be able to flourish in secret.
Okay, one of the sort of fascinating characters that emerge in the book you co-authored, Betrayal, is Cardinal Law. Man of great faith, campaigner for civil rights, takes positions against racism, reaches out to the immigrant community. On the other hand, he sweeps, you know, all the allegations, the charges under the carpet. I just wonder how you regard him. Was he a kind of misguided, you know, blinkered person who just out of his faith would go any distance to defend the church and protect the church? Or was there a kind of callous disregard as well, just because, you know, of the prevailing culture at that time, that he wasn't actually bothered about this phenomenon of pedophilia and sexual abuse at all?
Well, Cardinal Law is an interesting character. He's a complex man. I could say a lot of good things about Cardinal Law. Cardinal Law raised a lot of money for some very important causes. In particular, he was known as a champion of the immigrant community in Boston. And it was not that long ago, for instance, I'm friends with someone who does work in the immigrant community, and she said to me, you know, in the old days, when we had a financial problem, we would just go to Cardinal Law, and he would get people to write a check. And now we can't do that. You know, Cardinal Law was also at the head of the Catholic Church's fairly new effort to be ecumenical. You know, Cardinal Law was in favor of opening up relations with the leaders of other Jewish faiths. At one point, he was prominent in the civil rights movement. He was a priest in Natchez, Mississippi. I have to say, Cardinal Law is also very politically shrewd. You know, in the 1960s, I think the church in America was a liberal crusading organization. It's become a very conservative organization, and I think Cardinal Law, is someone who was politically astute, politically adroit, and politically ambitious, is someone who kind of went with the political winds, and I think he was a liberal church leader when it was fashionable to be a liberal church leader, and became very conservative to the point where he would lead the anti-abortion demonstrations on Boston Common every year for many years. When it comes to his responsibility for clergy sex abuse in the Boston Archdiocese, I have to say I'm astounded and also quite mystified. He knew everything. I mean, I've personally seen his calendar, and I know that he personally met with these priests who were serial abusers. He literally knew everything. He knew what the specific priests had done. And yet he orchestrated the cover-up, and he allowed these priests to continue in ministry, shuffling them from one parish to another, as you said, putting more and more children in harm's way, and in fact allowing more and more children to be terribly sexually abused. He seems to be completely unaware of the consequences of sexual abuse for children. I think he is one of the many church leaders who was more concerned about protecting the institution and defending priests than he was about the people the institution is supposed to serve. You know, I was reminded a little bit when I was doing this investigation of covering the police. You know, whenever there was an incidence of police brutality or police corruption, the police just instinctively would circle the wagons. And no matter what the allegation, no matter the seriousness of the crime that might have been committed by a police officer, the first reaction of people in the police department was to protect their own. And I think the Catholic Church is very similar, and I think Cardinal Law was the chief protector of his priests, even if they were serial pedophiles, and of the institution of the Catholic Church. This was a man, after all, who did believe that he might become the first American Pope. I do find it hard to understand how he sleeps at night, quite honestly.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there is that strand where, you know, the argument that they're aware of something, but there is a sort of other strand that runs through, you know, certain characters, and certain incidents that the book refers to. For instance, there's the film as well. There's someone called Paquin, is it, who is almost, you know, says, you know, what wrong have I done? You know, I just fooled around. And there is this suggestion in the book that this was a kind of almost like a kind of club that thought that this was all right. You know, they didn't make too much of it. It wasn't circling the wagons or, you know, shielding someone from a horrible crime, but it was almost like, you know, this is a sort of minor, you know, peccadillo. We can deal with this. Wasn't that a part of the culture, prevailing culture at the time as well?
Yes, and I think one of the characteristics of pedophiles in general, whether they're a priest or a school teacher or you know, your uncle living in the next town, one of the characteristics of pedophiles is they don't believe they're doing anything wrong. They have a hard time understanding the harm they're causing to the child. And I think this is one of the reasons clinicians find it so difficult to cure pedophilia or to change people who are pedophiles, is deep down they don't believe they've done anything wrong. And you're right, I think we found that there were many priests who fit this description. And I think the sexual abuse of children was so prevalent that it did seem almost commonplace. And I think that there is, as incredible as it may seem, there was an attitude of, hey, look, what's the big deal? This has been going on for a long time. A lot of people do it. What's the big deal? I do think that was part of the attitude. You know, when we started our investigation, we started with one priest, John Gagan. And this was a man who abused more than 150 children in 6 different parishes over 30 years with the knowledge of 2 cardinals, Cardinal Law and his predecessor, Cardinal Medeiros. But as we scratched the surface, so to speak, we found that there might be as many as 6 priests like John Gagan. And before long, we thought, wow, there might be a dozen. And that was kind of mind-blowing. And then you see in the movie, very authentically, you know, we developed this database that suggests that there are maybe scores of priests. And then we talked to our expert, I call him our guru, Richard Sipe, who did all this initial research on the sexuality of Catholic priests, not just on pedophilia, but overall the sexuality, the sexual lives of Catholic priests. And he gave us his 6% number, and as you see, we quickly calculate that that's 90, and our minds were really blown when we understood that might be the truth. Today, that number is up to 250 just in the Boston Archdiocese. So that's how prevalent the problem is. And when you think about the fact that most priests are moved around, even if they're not caught sexually abusing someone, they're generally rotated every 5 to 7 years. So you think about a priest who is a sexual abuser rotating through maybe 4 or 5 different parishes over a career, and you really start to understand how close all children were in the Boston Archdiocese to abusive priests. And by the way, I don't think there's anything funny about the water in Boston. You know what I mean? I mean, I don't think Boston is special. I think this is a problem in the Catholic Church across America and all over the world.
Yeah, which brings me to my next question, which is, I mean, you mentioned SIPE, so I just want to say, would it be fair to say that the press was much too slow and much too lethargic in waking up to this? You had the Gilbert Gartha case that goes back to the mid-80s. You had a report following that put out by the Catholic clergy themselves, which I think, if I recall, Cardinal Law okayed, and then this was 85. Then you had the Porter case, which was covered by the Globe team in the 90s, I think it was. And then you had the Richard Sype book, which had, as you say, documented out of a matric that 6% of the Catholic clergy were engaged in some form of sexual abuse. So my question is this: did it really have to wait for Spotlight and until 2002?
It's a very fair question, and I would say the short answer is, yeah, the media, we were late, and we could have broken the story earlier, I think. I mean, there had been many scandals in the Catholic Church about priests who were serial child molesters. As you mentioned, there was the Gilbert Gartha case in Louisiana. I think that was 1984. There was a big case in Dallas, Texas, the case of Rudy Koss, and then there was, as you mentioned, there was a case of a priest named James Porter who was in Fall River, Massachusetts, just about an hour's drive from Boston. And the Globe covered it. So I think there was a failure to connect the dots.
But it wasn't just picked up. I mean, you covered it, but this case just didn't go national. Was there a reason for that? Why this was covered in little local papers, but it just didn't get the prominence it probably deserved?
Yes, I think part of it is
was there a different attitude to pedophilia? Has it changed over the years?
I think pedophilia is better understood than it was, but I think there's a different attitude toward the Catholic Church. I think in decades past there was really a profound deference to the Catholic Church. There was a feeling that priests could do no wrong. There was a feeling that this is the most moral institution in our society. How could this possibly be true? So when church officials would come out and say, yes, we're having a pedophile scandal, but this is just one bad priest, this is one bad apple in a barrel of very, very fine priests, I think everyone was generally inclined to believe that. Now, reporters are supposed to be skeptical. So I think, it's a fair charge that we weren't skeptical enough. However, I would just say one additional thing, that our investigation into the Boston Archdiocese, we had a unique window because we were able to get the church's own internal documents. And no reporter had ever had that opportunity before. I mean, we proved our case with the church's own internal records. We had the letters written to and by Cardinal Law and his predecessor, Cardinal Madero. So, well, we're going to take some questions afterwards, but that's a very good question, and I'd be happy to explain it. So we did have this sort of mind-blowing opportunity to see and prove that there was a cover-up at the highest levels of the church. And that's what made our investigation different than all the other stories that had come before. And I think that's why we triggered a national and then a global scandal, because we proved that there was a cover-up. And we were able to do it because of a unique set of circumstances and some pretty persistent reporting that allowed us to get these documents, which were really the key to everything.
Yeah, there is this moment in Spotlight when you discover that these documents are available, they're lodged there, they're public, they can be accessed. And those documents established that Cardinal Law was aware of the sexual abuse problem and the extent of it, and that he actually, chose to ignore it. But then the editor of the Spotlight team, Walter Robinson, wants to hold out and says he wants more work done to expose the full extent of the rot within the church. And this gets you all hot under the collar in the film, and you're really angry with him, and so on. In retrospect, do you think Walter was right in holding out? Or?
Well, this is an embarrassing scene for me, and I had some interesting conversations with Ruffalo before the scene was shot. But in any case, I just want to point out, I do believe I was right, and that's what happened. The first story, the movie kind of goes over this very, very quickly. You kind of have to be paying attention to really appreciate it. But in fact, the first story we wrote was about the cover-up. And the story that Walter Robinson was saying we should do first, essentially we did last. We wrote 4 blockbuster stories in January of 2002, and the first story was about the cover-up, and I think that's really what was the bomb that went off. And the second story, I was able to get Cardinal Law's psychiatric records, and the second story was really about John Gagin's MO, how he targeted kids from working-class families, usually who lived in households with single moms. And then eventually, because of legal action that the Globe took as an institution, which was quite important, we got all the records in the Gagin case. That was 10,000 pages of records regarding one priest. And then finally, at the end of the month, the 4th story we wrote was the one that Walter Robinson was insisting on publishing first on the scope of the problem. And in that story, we reported that there might be 70 priests. And that also was like a second bomb that went off. And as I said before, now there are 250 just in the Boston Archdiocese. So in fact, I believed the key was the cover-up, and we should go with that story first. And in fact, it's what we did.
Yeah, you wrote in Betrayal that the sexual abuse story, the clergy sexual abuse story, is still unfolding. A decade after 2002, and it's sort of a line, a sort of reminder when you ran the story last month, saying that thousands of illegitimate children, some of them living in secrecy and sorrow and perhaps some shame as well, in different parts of the world, fathered by Catholic priests. So, how much of the iceberg have we actually uncovered?
Well, the story does seem to continue to unfold all over the world. Very recently, Cardinal George Pell of Australia, he was the 3rd highest ranking official at the Vatican, and recently he was criminally charged with child sexual abuse in Australia. This is really quite significant, I think, because it goes to the Vatican's inability to come up with a set of protocols that can be put in place around the world to prevent child sexual abuse. I have to say, I have to give the American bishops credit. 4 months after we published our first story, the bishops in the United States got together and had a big meeting in Dallas, Texas, and they produced a document called the Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People. And it's a very good document. That is designed to deal with clergy sexual abuse in a forthright, transparent way. One of the things it does is requires bishops to go to civil authorities, i.e. the police, whenever they find evidence of child sexual abuse by a priest. So I give the American bishops credit. However, the Vatican has not followed suit. Pope Francis appointed a commission to study this issue 3 years ago, and they have not come up with anything. And I think the situation with Cardinal George Pell is going to just continue to happen over and over again until the Vatican is able to deal with the situation. Now, you're referencing, recently I published another investigation into the issue of the children of Catholic priests. I said earlier that many priests were having sex with women and men and children. Probably the smallest cohort, I would say definitely the smallest cohorts, having sex with children. So there are thousands of children of Catholic priests all over the world who often live lives in states of financial and emotional deprivation. Some of these children of priests don't learn that their biological father is a Catholic priest till later in life, till they're in their 30s or 40s, and the information can be incredibly destabilizing. So this is another problem that the church has failed to deal with over the decades and centuries, even though, just very similar to clergy sexual abuse, there has been scandal after scandal after scandal of high church officials who have had to resign when it became publicly known that they had fathered children. So it's a very parallel situation, and once again, if you look through the volumes of canon law, it's as if the children of priests don't exist. There's no mention of what a bishop, for instance, should do when it becomes clear to him that one of his priests has fathered a child, thereby violating church law. So, you know, I talked to, for instance, the Archbishop of Dublin, who was very candid about this. He says, we have no guidance whatsoever. Bishops are basically have to handle this in whatever way they see fit. Some are equipped to do it. Some might be bewildered. Some might not be equipped to do it. So once again, it's really up to the Vatican to provide some guidance for bishops and for priests who give in to temptation and father children. And you know, there has to be some guidelines for what they're to do. And so once again, it's up to the Vatican to come up with a set of protocols. And boy, there sure are a lot of people out there waiting for that to happen.
A question about the film. When books and sort of real life stories are made into films, you know, you hear writers frequently saying, you know, this film has nothing to do with the book, or you have people saying, you know, I mean, I don't even recognize that character in the film. But based on what I've read on the internet, I mean, you and others on the Spotlight team seem to think that there's a sort of fair amount or a great amount of authenticity in the manner, in the characterization and the plot in the film Spotlight. So would it be fair to say that there wasn't much cinematic license in the film? It was fairly true to what happened? Or?
Yes, it's a very authentic film. You know, often you go to the movies and it'll say at the beginning, based on a true story. And I thought that with this movie it should say, it's really, really based on a true story. Because it's very, very authentic in spirit and substance. I mean, the film compresses a 5-month investigation into 2 hours. So there are composite characters, there are events that are conflated, there is some dramatic license taken, but overall, I think it's an incredibly authentic work. And we, those of us in the Spotlight team, we all love the movie because it directs more attention to the issue of the victims of clergy sex abuse, which we think is incredibly important. It validates the stories of the victims of clergy sex abuse, which we think is also incredibly important. And I think it gives people an understanding of how important investigative reporting is and the role it plays in our society. So for all those reasons, we love the movie, but also, boy, do we recognize ourselves, and it's pretty eerie.
Yeah. Ruffalo met you before the film, did he? Or did he spend time with you to sort of try and understand who you were and your characteristics and so on? I mean, was that a part of the way it happened, or?
Yes, all of the actors spent time with their doppelgangers, and you know, we would go out to dinner with them or lunch with them, and we'd have a good time, and we'd have a few drinks, and we didn't really appreciate that they were working; they were studying us. And with Ruffalo, you know, he came to my house, and we hung out, and you know, he just got to see how I lived, and. One day we were talking and talking and talking, literally for hours, and we found that we had a lot in common. You know, we come from similar family backgrounds. We both were raised Catholic. You know, he's half Italian, half French Canadian. I'm half Portuguese, half French Canadian. We have the same initials. I mean, it got a little weird, you know. And then we were walking down the street, and a couple of friends of mine stopped by on their bicycles, and one of them is a fellow reporter at the Globe. So he basically started interviewing them about me, which I didn't really appreciate. especially when my so-called friend, the other reporter at the Globe, started telling him about my, my hot-blooded temper. So it was not something I really wanted to share with him, but sort of the secret was out. And then he came to the Globe and he hung out with me, and he literally sat down next to me at my desk and he listened to me interview people on the phone. And at the time I was doing this investigation of these deaths at a state prison that houses guys who are mentally ill, and I had some video, some horrific video of a death scene. And I was trying to figure out if there were errors committed when they were trying to revive this this mentally ill man who'd been strapped down to a bed by his wrists and ankles. He was being tortured. And so there was this, the video was very low quality, very, very grainy. So I was going back and forth over this particular part of the video, and I felt Mark grab the mouse out of my hand. And he started going back and forth over it. And I thought he wanted to be the guy who was going to see if there was anything wrong with the oxygen tank, you know?
Okay, just a couple of general questions about journalism before we turn it over to the audience. This is on exclusives, which is your stock in trade, really, in say, the digital age. In the old days, you ran an exclusive in newspaper, and it lasted 24 hours till the next, somebody else picked it up the next day. Television changed that a bit. Now, in the age of the internet, exclusives, you know, don't last more than a few seconds sometimes. And I've seen that happen all the time. We put out a story, and then within, you know, seconds, somebody else has it as if it's their story. Do you think this is kind of detracted from an important facet of the work of journalists, which is to break stories, to sort of push the envelope, take things forward?
Well, I think it depends on how you would define an exclusive. For instance, you know, if you have an exclusive story based on something somebody in the White House leaked to you, that's the kind of story that's going to last about 20 minutes before another news organization can match it. At the most, a story of that nature will last a day before somebody can match it. But the kind of stories I do, the exclusive nature of the stories do last for quite a long time. For instance, in my recent series on the children of Catholic priests, I mean, I worked for that on and off, but mostly on for about a year. And by the time I published, I had so much information that essentially nobody could catch up. And nobody was going to really get it from another source unless they really, really worked hard at it. So I think when it comes to investigative reporting, the exclusive still has value, and the exclusive still lasts. You know, I did an investigation into the cover-up of the death of a young man who was killed by prison guards. And, you know, I spent 5 months on that investigation, and we published, and it was a bombshell. But basically nobody could catch up. Nobody else had the documents, and they weren't going to get the documents.
Okay. So there is still, you think, an important role for newspapers to commit resources and time into teams like Spotlight, but very few do. So what makes the Globe do this?
Well, there are two reasons we do this. I mean, right now I can tell you the Spotlight team at the Globe is bigger than it was when the movie came out. As you see in the movie, we had 4 people on the Spotlight team, and everybody worked on the same project at once. Now we have 6 people on the Spotlight team, and everybody does not work on the same project at once. We might have 2 people working together on a project and 2 people working on a separate project. And for instance, I worked on the investigation of the children of Catholic priests. I did that one alone. And so the idea is that we can have a Spotlight story coming out 3, 4, 5 times a year instead of just once or twice. But the other reason we've decided to do this, I mean, one reason we do this is we believe in investigative reporting. It's our responsibility to hold the powerful accountable. It's our responsibility under the First Amendment, and we take that very, very seriously. But at the Boston Globe, we believe this also is good business. You know, we have these incredible analytics now. When we put our stories out online, We know which stories are being read by how many people. We even know the average amount of time that people are spending on a particular story. And we know which stories are driving online subscriptions. We have an incredible amount of knowledge about this. And what we're finding is that our investigative stories, also our long-form narrative stories, are what's driving subscriptions. So we believe that investigative journalism is good business. That is not a belief held by many editors around the country. Most editors are really strapped for resources, but so are the editors at the Globe. I mean, overall, our staff at the Globe has declined significantly, but we have increased the staff of the Spotlight team because our readers love it and they're subscribing because of those stories.
Well, one form of investigative journalism, and I think I'm asking this because I come from a country where this kind of journalism has become very common and sometimes almost in an unregulated fashion, is undercover journalism, or journalism by using false pretenses. The Spotlight team, of course, didn't use that for its investigation on sexual abuse, but I just want to know, where do you stand on undercover journalism? Do you feel that there are circumstances under which they are justified, or is it not justified at all?
Well, this is an interesting question, and I don't think there's an ironclad answer to it. I can tell you that there are some stories you can only get by going undercover. I can also tell you that...
Is that a justification for getting it? I mean, the only way I can get it?
It depends on the situation. It depends on the story. Now, for instance, I mean, I can give you some real-life examples. It's our policy at the Globe. We do not do that. And we believe that there's an ethical, moral inconsistency in doing something, in basically lying to show that someone else is doing something wrong. And we don't think readers particularly care for that kind of reporting either. So I think we've been very, very consistent. It's just something we just don't believe in it, we don't do it. However, that does mean that there are some stories that you're not going to get, and I'll give you an example. We on the Spotlight team had a story about discrimination in the rental housing market. In the state of Massachusetts, there's what we call a lead paint law. You know, lead paint can cause brain damage to a young child. So in the state of Massachusetts, if you're a landlord and you rent to a family that has children under 6 years old, you have to de-lead the apartment. You have to pay someone to strip all the lead paint off the walls and windowsills, which a young child would typically make chew on if they're teething. And it costs money. So what's the result? The result is, if you have children under 6, it's really tough to rent an apartment. And we knew this was going on in a systemic way because the story was brought to us by a real estate agent. And we sat around, we said, well, how can we get this? How can we get this? And we decided that the only way we could get it will be to pose as someone with a family trying to rent an apartment. And so for that reason, we took a pass. And, you know, I'm still smarting over that. I mean, it was my story. I brought it in, and I'm still a little bit smarting about that. You know, you're all going to hear later from my friend Suki Kim, who went undercover in North Korea for 6 months, very courageously, I might add. And, you know, that was a situation where North Korea is so secretive that it's very difficult to do any reporting at all there, and some reporting there would be very, very valuable. And it literally was the only way to get the story. So I'd say that example would be an exception to what I think should be the rule.
Wonderful. So, questions? Okay, lady in red.
I've got a microphone for you right here.
Is about the role of conspiracy theories and how does it play into your investigative journalism. Sometimes, you know, these theories that we dismiss end up, you know, sort of leading us to stories. So what is your opinion on that? Do you dismiss it out of hand, or do you spend some time thinking about it?
Well, yes. I mean, you know, as I said before, the Boston Globe Spotlight team did not discover clergy sex abuse. And there were previous scandals. There was also a gentleman who would stand in front of the Vice President's house in Washington every day with a sign that said, "I've been raped by a priest." And he was ignored by literally thousands of public officials and journalists every day. And yet, he had a story. He had a very, very big story. So I think, for me, it's not really so much about, I don't really like conspiracy theories unless I can find some, as I say, some meat on the bone. You know, but what I would say is very important for reporters to listen to people that we might not normally talk to. It's very important for us to listen to people who are not in our income group, who are not in our, who don't live in our neighborhoods. It's very important for us to consider constituencies that are voiceless, because I think one of our responsibilities is to give those constituencies a voice. So it's very important for us to talk to people who are not like ourselves. But I must say, on the other hand, I do hear a lot of conspiracy theories, and boy, you know, usually they're just impossible to prove, and I tend to kind of brush them off.
Yeah, gentleman in front there. Yeah, both of them. All right.
This two-part question. You alluded a little bit to the fact that the community couldn't, that was one of the things that came through in the movie, was everybody knew, okay, this happened, the Catholic Church tried to cover it up, but the thing that really surprised me was how much the community colluded in it. And the second part of the question is, you talked about, or one of the questions was, were you late? The movie implied that if it wasn't a new editor who was Jewish and didn't like baseball and beer, that this investigation wouldn't have happened.
Well, I think all of that is true. There was there was a conspiracy of silence. A lot of people knew what was happening and did nothing. That's absolutely true. The police covered up for the church. The district attorneys covered up for the church. There really was a conspiracy of silence. And I have to say, I think that Marty Baron coming to the Globe, I think it's not just that he didn't like baseball, didn't like to drink beer, and was Jewish. I think what was important about Marty Baron was he was coming from outside of Boston. You know, Boston used to be a very, very parochial city. People lived there their whole lives. They lived in the same neighborhood, usually dominated by a Catholic church their entire lives. The other thing that's significant about Marty is he was coming from Miami. And he was the editor of the Miami Herald before he was the editor of the Globe. And Florida has what are perhaps the best, we call them the sunshine laws in the United States. I mean, and what I mean by sunshine laws are, these are laws that say the public has records to documents. So when it was presented to Marty that a judge had decided to put a seal on records turned over during this discovery process that normally would be available to the public, to Marty that just didn't add up. Because, you know, in Florida it just wouldn't happen. But here in Boston, everybody seemed willing to accept this notion. And to Marty it just didn't add up. And so he said, well, what if we challenge this? And people said, what do you mean, we're going to challenge the Catholic Church? And he said, well, yeah. That's called journalism. So I give Marty all the credit in the world.
I have a case pending right now in federal court against the Catholic Church, Arupe Jesuit. I'm the attorney on the case. And I'm facing a hearing on Tuesday where the attorneys for the Catholic Church are trying to get the whole case sealed retroactively and forward. And I was wondering if you could comment on the litigation tactics that you saw that may be similar in the Boston Archdiocese to what I'm experiencing right now with the attorneys for the Catholic Church.
Yeah, it's a good question. And, you know, there's an interesting, for all the lawyers in the audience and constitutional students of our Constitution, you know, there's an interesting aspect of the First Amendment. I mean, everybody knows that the First Amendment protects freedom of speech and the First Amendment protects freedom of the press, but the First Amendment also protects freedom of religion. And so religious institutions enjoy special rights in the United States. They don't have to file a lot of documents that most other institutions have to file. And often when there's litigation about clergy sexual abuse, the church makes the argument that we're protected by the First Amendment and we don't have to turn over any documents. And then when the decision is, well, your only church doctrine is protected, situations where civil law might have been violated is not protected, well, then the church will make the argument, well, okay, but then these records should be sealed because we are the Catholic Church and we have reputations to protect. I have not done a specific survey about this, but this was an argument that the Catholic Church made in Boston when we filed a motion to intervene in the Gagin lawsuits and get the seal unsealed. This was an argument made by the Catholic Church, and the judge in the case, another unsung hero, Constance Sweeney, the product of 16 years of Catholic education, she ruled in favor of the Globe. Now I know that lawyers around the country faced in similar situations, filing similar litigation, have filed similar motions, and they've been unsuccessful. So I think a lot depends on the judge you get. What we argued specifically is that this was a case of the welfare of children, and that the welfare of children was more important and more in the public interest than protection of the reputation of the leaders of the Boston Archdiocese. And ultimately, that was the argument that prevailed, if that's helpful.
Gentleman on the left there, yeah.
Yes. Has there ever been a subpoena issued? Why don't some of the prosecutors in Massachusetts or Connecticut for cardinal law, why hasn't there been a subpoena issued to him? And then number two, have you done anything on the Native Americans? There's a whole scandal out there that hasn't been written about, especially the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota and elsewhere, of abuse that just nobody seems to care about.
Sure. I mean, first of all, subpoenas were issued to church leaders, and Cardinal Law was deposed, and and not only that, but his deposition was covered live. There were microphones in there. His deposition was covered live. So subpoenas are issued, and top church officials, including cardinals, are occasionally called to testify or occasionally called to be deposed, and that happens, and that's happened frequently at this point. That's happened in lawsuits all over the country. When it comes to the Native American reservations, are you speaking about abuse by Catholic priests? Yes, I think this has been undercovered personally. There have been some just outrageous scandals involving abuse, particularly by Jesuit priests at Native American reservations. You're absolutely right about that, and I think because these reservations are located in remote areas where there isn't much media, I think that's the reason that they've been undercovered. But I couldn't agree more with you. Unfortunately, I think more attention should have been directed to these scandals.
So you said that celibacy required in the Catholic Church is sort of one of the reasons behind all of this happening. But celibacy has only been a requirement for about 800 years. It's not something that goes back all the way. And as a Catholic yourself, is there any thought in the Church to get rid of this celibacy? 800 years
is a long time, yeah.
No, but the Church has been around for much longer than that.
Well, the gentleman is absolutely right. The Catholic Church has been around for 2,000 years, and the celibacy requirement was instituted
12th century, yeah.
Yes. And so, there are some reasons. There are reasons for celibacy. I mean, the idea, the Catholics believe, for instance, that Jesus Christ never had sex. And so the idea behind celibacy is sort of twofold. One, it's an attempt to emulate the life of Jesus. And also the idea is that if a priest does not marry, he will have more time and energy to devote to the people he is supposed to serve. And in effect, his wife will be the church. That's the idea behind it. It's proven to be unrealistic to a significant degree. I personally think that the church is not close to considering changing the celibacy requirement. I think the tradition is it's too long, it's too strong. There are too many high church officials who support it. I don't see any sign, if I try to read the tea leaves within the Vatican, which is not a very easy thing to do, but I don't see any movement within the Vatican for change. I see a lot of call for change among Catholics and among former priests outside the church for change, but I don't think those calls for change are making much of an impact within the Vatican. That's my opinion.
Hi, this is a question to you, both of you as journalists and as readers. We had an election this last year of which the topic of fake news comes up. How are we as readers, and it's going to happen more and more, these stories come out, whether they're investigative or whatever, how are as journalists, as an institution, going to look at this? So as we as readers, as a story comes up, you know, how do we know what it is? What's the legitimacy of it? How are we going to look at this? Because as you know, as all of us know, this last election was basically sabotaged by so many stories out there, and with the advent of our cell phones, smartphones, we look at this and we tend to grab a story that justifies our point of view, you know, legitimate or not. So how are we as a society, as journalists, as readers, to go in these waters, particularly with this technology that's just going to get more immediate?
Yeah, it's an area, I think, of very, very serious concern. I mean, you know, there was a senator from the state of New York years ago, and he was in debate on the Senate floor, and he said to the guy he was debating, he said, you know, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And I think, unfortunately, in our society, we've reached a point where people feel that they are entitled to their own facts. And we sometimes have a lot of trouble agreeing on what the facts are. We have trouble agreeing on what reality is. And that's pretty discouraging because, you know, in years past, we could all agree on what the facts were. We could all agree on what reality was. We just had some different opinions on what to do about it. So I think we do need to get to a place in our society when we can agree on what the truth is. And there is a truth. I think as a journalist, I think our responsibility is to produce stories that are fact-based. Facts matter is the slogan at the Globe. And I think what readers and citizens do have a responsibility to try to ferret out what's true and what's not. This is more difficult than it's ever been in the past. However, you know, democracy does come with responsibility. You know, democracy comes with the responsibility of being informed so that we can make the decisions that we fortunately have the freedom to make. So I do think, you know, all of us, all citizens have a responsibility to try to determine for themselves what is real and what is fake as far as the news goes. It's not easy. It's more difficult than it's ever been. But I still think this is a joint responsibility by journalists who need to produce stories that are fact-based, and readers who have to make, readers, viewers, listeners, who have to make the effort in their very, very busy lives to figure out what the truth is.
Okay, I think we have time just for one more, and thank you all for your compassion as I try and be as equitable as possible.
I'm Renate Zadruzinski. I'm from Germany. And in Bavaria, the Catholic Church has offices that deal with children of priests. They are, in many cases, put up for adoption, but both sides, the new parents and the birth mother, have to promise not to reveal to the child or anybody else that this was a child of a priest. They tend to support the new parents, or if the mother wants to keep the child, with some money, with some other moral support, but they have to promise not to reveal it. And they have acknowledged that there is a problem, and a huge problem. They have offices in all the dioceses for this matter, but under the seal of secrecy.
Well, that's very interesting. And yes, part of the problem with the Catholic Church is the veil of secrecy over everything. You know, I think part of the struggle that the children of priests face is this secrecy. Often they discover they're adopted. Often their parents tell them they're adopted. And of course, it's natural for them to want to learn the truth about their parentage. And the church, in an effort, I think, to protect itself, not the children or the parents, but in an effort to protect itself, require that this matter be kept a secret. And I think the secrecy in and of itself ends up being very destructive to the children of priests who are adopted.
Hi, just one last question.
One last question, okay.
My name is Christopher Flores, and again, we are at GLF, and I was actually raised Catholic in India. And And as you know, there's a large, the Catholic Church has a big role to play in India. It controls a number of educational institutions, some of the better ones, including boarding schools. And I'm sure a lot of Indians here are products of these institutions. So the question I have actually for both of you is, are you aware of similar investigations about sexual abuse amongst the Catholic clergy in India? Understanding that the context of the church in India is different. It's not quite connected with the levers of power that it is in Western Europe and US. But maybe Mukund, you might have a response.
I can say something of a very sketchy nature here, but it's an interesting question because I don't have the whole facts at my command. We do know people who are working on this area in my town. And interestingly, and this is before I saw Spotlight and before I read the book, there seems to be a pattern. I don't know how extensive this is, and I don't really know how many people are involved at this stage. So I think it's much too premature to hazard a guess or make an estimate. But this moving around seems to have happened. People get sent from the United States here, and they are back home to India. So there is that phenomenon which has been pointed out to me. We are in the process of looking at it, but it's just much too early days to kind of say anything definitive about it. But apparently, and this tied in, and with when I was reading Betrayal, that this was happening in the States, but people just get sent back home. That happens as well. With that. I think we really apologize. I think there are many questions and we seem to have run out of time. But if you'll permit me, I'd just like to ask the audience a question, if that's all right. I have this friend who's written a book, a journalist lady, who wrote this book called Bitter Chocolate, and it's about child sexual abuse, largely made up in India. And she starts the book with this staggering statistic, which says that I don't remember the exact number, but it's almost like 4 out of 5 women have faced some form of sexual abuse when they were growing up, and the number is pretty large for boys as well. I mean, for men as well, but it's a little less so. And I was just wondering, what people think about it. And these are stats that can never be proved conclusively one way or another. So I just want to have an audience poll, if that's permitted. How many of you think that 50% of, say, people have experienced some form of sexual abuse as a child? More than 50%? At least. Yeah, staggering. So I think this is proof that this problem that we have, is enormous, and I think that just shows, the extent of great work that you've done in exposing this, and a big round of applause. Thank you so much.